We begin with the current backdrop, the relationship between Turkey, Ankara, and Egypt, Cairo. For many years, they were often at odds, diverging on issues such as Libya, the Muslim Brotherhood, maritime boundaries in the Eastern Mediterranean, and regional influence. Recently, however, we see both countries forging closer cooperation. For instance, they revived a joint naval maneuver after a 13-year hiatus, the exercise dubbed Sea of Friendship, signaling something much more than a goodwill gesture. That shift is happening precisely at a time when Russia's influence in the Middle East is undergoing pressure. Moscow has historically been a major actor, in Syria through arms sales, diplomacy, and as a counterbalance to Western influence. But recent reportage suggests its sway is being challenged, particularly as other regional powers, including Turkey and Egypt, recalibrate. Now, let's unpack why Turkey and Egypt might be feeling on high alert with respect to Russia, what the motivations are, what are the risks and opportunities, and what this could mean moving forward. Why Turkey is alert. Let's look at Turkey's situation. Turkey occupies a strategic location, a NATO member straddling Europe and Asia with long-term involvement in Syria, the Black Sea, and growing interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has pursued an assertive foreign policy, often balancing between the West, Russia, and regional actors. Recently, Turkey's relationship with Russia has been complicated. On one hand, energy, trade, and diplomacy. On the other, sanctions, arms deals, and divergent interests. For example, Turkish companies were sanctioned for supplying goods to Russia's war effort. Moreover, Turkey's renewed cooperation with Egypt and others signals a willingness to break out of older alignments. The joint naval exercises between Turkey and Egypt were viewed as a message, not only to Israel, but implicitly to any actor whose regional behavior Turkey wants to influence or respond to. So Turkey might be alert to Russia because Russia's moves in Syria, Ukraine diplomacy, impact Turkey's own strategic calculations, and Turkey is no longer content to be a passive actor. Why Egypt is alert. Turning to Egypt, Cairo has long held a complex relationship with both Russia and Turkey. Egypt's domestic politics, its stance on Islamist movements, notably the Muslim Brotherhood, its military-led government under President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and its key role in regional affairs, Gaza, Libya, Sudan, all give it leverage, but also strategic vulnerability. Egypt's cooperation with Turkey in recent months, including joint military naval activities and mutual positions on the Gaza conflict, suggests Cairo is seeking new partnerships in response to changes around it. At the same time, Egypt watches Russia's involvement in the region. Russia has in the past been a partner, but it is less able now to carry the diplomatic or economic weight it once did, particularly due to the war in Ukraine, sanctions, and shifting Arab priorities. So Egypt, too, may be alert to Russia, not necessarily in hostility, but concerned about how Russia's moves might affect Egypt's interests, whether in Libya, the Eastern Mediterranean, or in the broader regional balance. What is the nature of the high alert? What might Turkey and Egypt be anticipating? When I say they are on high alert with respect to Russia, I mean several things. Geopolitical maneuvers, Russia's diplomatic outreach into the Arab world, or attempts to reassert influence via arms, security deals, and alliances. Turkey and Egypt would want to keep track of these to ensure their own interests are not undermined. For example, Russia's attempt to convene a Russia-Arab summit saw poor Arab response, signaling a diminished but still relevant role. Military strategic risk. Moves by Russia in neighboring theaters, Syria, Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean have spillover potential. Turkey especially has military involvement and direct interests in Syria and along its border with the Mediterranean. Egypt also has significant military and strategic stakes, Gaza, Libya, Red Sea, etc. Economic and security intersections, sanctions on Russia, trade flows, and partnerships with Western powers may force Turkey and Egypt to navigate carefully. For example, Turkish companies were sanctioned for involvement in dual-use goods for Russia. Meanwhile, Egypt must balance its ties with Russia, the US, and other Arab states. Alliance shifting. Both Turkey and Egypt are recalibrating alliances. Turkey is repositioning itself as a broker in Gaza, for instance, Egypt is expected to lead a four-nation stabilization force in Gaza, with Turkey participating. These shifts mean that old alliances, including those with Russia, are being revisited, which naturally generates caution. How Russia fits into the picture, and why Turkey and Egypt care. Let's zoom in on Russia's role, to understand why its behavior matters for Turkey and Egypt. Russia has been a major player in the Middle East for years, intervening in Syria in 2015 to support the Assad regime, forging arms deals across the region, maintaining bases, diplomatic leverage, energy partnerships. But recent analysis points to its influence waning somewhat, particularly as the war in Ukraine consumes resources and as regional actors look elsewhere for partners. Against this backdrop, Turkey and Egypt may perceive that Russia, in an attempt to maintain influence, could make moves, diplomatic, military, economic, that upset regional balances, e.g., in Libya, the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria, or via energy-arms deals. They may fear being caught between Russia and the West or other regional powers if Russia pursues an aggressive or opportunistic policy. Or they may see an opportunity. If Russia's role is weakened, Turkey and Egypt could step in to fill the power vacuum, but doing so requires vigilance and strategic planning. They may also be wary that Russia will align with actors or policies that run counter to Turkey's or Egypt's interests, for example, in Libya, maritime zones, or in Syria. Hence, high alert does not necessarily mean adversarial confrontation, but rather heightened attentiveness, strategic caution, readiness to respond or engage. Key recent developments tying this all together. Turkey and Egypt revived joint naval exercises after many years. This is a strong signal of their willingness to cooperate militarily and diplomatically. Egypt is expected to lead a multi-nation force, including Turkey, for Gaza stabilization, which demonstrates new regional alignments and responsibilities. Russia planned a Russia-Arab League summit that had very low turnout and was ultimately postponed, seen as evidence of its reduced standing in the Arab world. Turkey's companies have been sanctioned by the U.S. for exporting goods to Russia that could support its war effort, highlighting the delicate tightrope Turkey walks between its various alliances. Implications for the region and us. What does this all mean? And for Turkey, Egypt, the Middle East, and beyond? For Turkey, being alert means Turkey is gearing up to play a more independent and central role in regional affairs, rather than being pulled along by larger powers. It also means Turkey must manage relationships carefully, with Russia, energy and trade, with NATO, the West, with Middle Eastern neighbors. Strategic missteps could cost Turkey, either by being sidelined or by getting caught in a conflict not of its making. For Egypt, Egypt's willingness to cooperate with Turkey and lead new regional initiatives, e.g., Gaza stabilization, suggests a shift from being reactive to being proactive. That shift comes with risk, misalignment with either Western powers or Russia, internal security concerns, and the burden of regional leadership. For Egypt, balancing is critical, maintaining ties with Russia, which remain important, while also aligning with emerging regional architectures. For the Middle East, the dynamic of alliances is shifting. Old rivalries are morphing, new partnerships forming. Turkey-Egypt cooperation is one such example. Russia's declining but still relevant role leaves an opening and risk for other actors. Regional security architecture may evolve around novel groupings, stabilization forces, joint exercises, naval cooperation, rather than static blocks. For smaller states in the region and for global powers, this means the chessboard is more complex. For the world, stability in hotspots like Gaza, Libya, the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria has global ramifications: energy, migration, security, diplomacy. If Turkey and Egypt succeed in managing their recalibrations, this could bring more regional autonomy and less dependency on great power interventions. Conversely, miscalculation could open space for conflict escalation, and global powers may find their influence challenged. What to watch for in the coming months? Here are some signs and developments worth tracking if you want to keep an eye on how this alert period plays out. Guards further military cooperation between Turkey and Egypt, additional joint drills, naval or air operations, perhaps in the Eastern Mediterranean or Red Sea theater. Statements or agreements from Russia, whether Moscow tries to assert influence in Libya, the Eastern Mediterranean, or with Arab states, and whether Turkey, Egypt respond. Trade and sanctions dynamics, especially how Turkey balances its trade with Russia, energy, minerals with its Western alliances, and how Egypt evolves its economic partnerships. Diplomatic moves around Gaza and Libya, both theaters where Turkey and Egypt are active. How Russia engages or is excluded may be telling.